I don't have a fancy intro for today's episode, so without further ado, let's just get straight on into it. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Cyratin Royal Fleet, what little there is, as well as Cyratin law enforcement. This might be a bit of a longer episode. Despite the fact that I said there's not a lot about the Royal Fleet, there is a decent amount. Not only that, but there's a significant amount for Cyratin law enforcement. Now, of course, some of you may be wondering, how is any of this relevant? I've been constantly talking about different topics. Some of them make sense, such as some of the more prevalent characters, but others just seem to be out of left field, seemingly completely random. This especially given that today's topic is Cyratin law enforcement. All of the episodes up until now, with the exception of maybe one or two, have been solely for leading up to the Ruined War itself. So, how does law enforcement get into this? Well, if I remember, we'll get into that when we get to law enforcement. But first, the Cyratin Royal Fleet. Now, as you probably gathered, the Cyratin Royal Fleet is adjacent with the Cyratin Royal Vanguard. This means that it is the personal defense fleet of not only Ostengrad, but also for the core system. Now, when I had talked in Alex's video, and I had said that there was that realitorial anchor zone that has the drop of Legend's blood in it, I had said that the vessels or the fleet at that location was a splinter of one of the 5 Holy Armada's branches. And I had said that it was in the tens of thousands, I believe. I didn't realize in the moment that I had said that, because that number is lowballing the hell out of these fleets. As a general rule of thumb, when it comes to the sheer massive fleets, you have the Holy Armada on top. Saying that there are billions or even trillions of vessels within this singular fleet, quote unquote, is lowballing the number. We're probably in the quintillions of vessels. However, you need to remember that all of these vessels aren't in the same location at once. They're oftentimes spread out across all 5 of the major factions' warfronts. After the Holy Armada, if a Cyratin Empire is capable of building one, there's the defense fleet of Cyrita, that massive synthetic planet that can pretty much hold off any offensive that there is. The 3rd and 4th spot go to the fleets around that realitorial anchor zone, as well as Ostengrad itself. Now, these two constantly flip-flop between each other as to which one is the most powerful. Generally, the realitorial anchor zone is slightly bigger than that of Ostengrad's, but at this point we're talking about fleets that are so massive, it really doesn't matter. We're talking about fleets that easily have tens, if not hundreds of millions of vessels. Now, you may be a little confused at that number, as that's an incredibly large number as a defense fleet for a planet that will be generous and say is a little bit bigger than Jupiter. Obviously, you can't fit tens or hundreds of millions of vessels around a singular planet. So, what's the deal here? Well, the major bulk of the Royal Fleet is primarily throughout the entirety of the core system. Whilst their primary job is to ensure the defense and protection of Ostengrad, due to the fact that there are so many vessels within this fleet, they're largely in charge of protecting the entirety of the core system. This means that the major bulk of them, if at all possible, is around Ostengrad, as well as the Crown World and the Throne World, whereas the rest of the fleet is scattered throughout the entirety of the solar system. In fact, this Royal Armada, or Royal Fleet, even has vessels out in deep space. These vessels are essentially early warning vessels. They run completely dark. Any and all systems that are not absolutely vital are shut down until they're no longer in service as one of these scout vessels. They have massive sensor arrays, and basically their job is to scan deep space for any possible incoming attacks, and then relay that information back to Ostengrad as well as the wider Royal Fleet. Now, when we had talked about different vessels, we had talked about the different classes of vessels, these being things like frigates, destroyers, cruisers, so on and so forth. However, we really never talked about the design of these vessels. I guess if I was to compare it to 40K, it would be the pattern of the vessel. This is largely due to the fact that there's not really a whole lot of them that are officially made. That being said, there are some iconic ones. The first one is known as the Iconoclast. Now, the Iconoclast is basically your bog standard. 90% of all vessels are Iconoclast, and they're basically jacks of all trades. You know, they're very balanced in what their ship class is supposed to do, but they don't necessarily have specialization. The majority of ship designs are unanimous across all different classes. This means that from the lowliest of frigates all the way to the mightiest of grand cruisers, Iconoclast designs do exist and are frequently used. That being said, there are situations in which a more, shall we say, specific design is required. As an example, we're going to talk about the destroyers. Destroyers are missile and torpedo boats that are designed as anti-capital. Now, we've talked about how the Cyratin Empire classifies vessels. This being frigates, destroyers, and cruisers are classified as standard ships. Then you have battleships and battlecruisers, which are categorized as capital ships. And finally, carriers and grand cruisers as flagships, although it's very rare to actually see a carrier as an actual flagship, as typically flagships are leading the charge. But I digress. That's aside from the point. Destroyers are designed as anti-capital. This doesn't mean that their missiles or torpedoes can outright kill a capital vessel in one hit. There's no destroyer alive that is capable of, in a single missile or a single torpedo, taking out a battleship, let alone a battle cruiser, which is significantly larger. Rather, the purpose of them is to do incredible amounts of damage if their munitions are not dealt with ahead of time. This means that they oftentimes have warheads sufficient enough to do serious damage, but not necessarily enough to outright cause crippling damage, at least depending on where the missile or torpedo hits. However, there is a type of destroyer or a design of destroyer that is specifically designed to be able to go even beyond this. This is known as the Titana destroyer. The Titana is essentially an anti-flagship. It has significantly less missile and torpedo bays, and in order to allow for more sustained battle, the locations where those torpedo and missile bays would have been is replaced with ammunition storage. These destroyers are not capable of staying in the battle for very long. That being said, the warheads that they have on their missiles and torpedoes are significantly stronger than any other design of destroyer. So much so that they can do serious damage to carriers and grand cruisers if they're not dealt with accordingly. These missiles are incredibly massive. They are insanely slow. They pack one hell of an explosion, though. And it should be noted that it's not just your standard chemical rockets, your standard explosive type rockets. There are energy variants that do exist, and some of them are absolutely devastating. However, all of this is leading up to one specific thing, and this is the Royal Fleet itself. The Royal Fleet itself utilizes a design unanimously throughout the entire fleet. They don't have specialized ones. They don't have Iconoclast. They don't have any of the others. They only have one design, and this is known as Galavier. Now, it should be noted that the difference between all other ship designs and Galavier is startling. Right off the gate, Galavier vessels, which again are solely within the defense fleet around Ostengrad, are anywhere between 1.5 to 2 times larger than their standard ships. This means that something like a frigate, an Iona-class frigate, they're usually around the size of an aircraft carrier, a modern-day aircraft carrier. A Galavier variant is anywhere between 1.5 to 2 times larger than an aircraft carrier. They are absolutely gigantic, each and every single vessel capable of hitting well beyond their normal weight class. For example, going back to destroyers, a Galavier destroyer easily is capable of fielding missiles and torpedoes that can deal debilitating damage to battleships and even battle cruisers if the missiles and torpedoes hit very specific spots. They are incredibly dangerous. Not only this, but the systems are far more advanced than what normal ships have access to. And this is due to the fact that something like an Iona class, its systems and all of that kind of stuff isn't really stellar. You know, it gets the job done, but it's nothing amazing. Now, you may be wondering, why? Well, the answer is simple. Production. The Cyratin Empire are constantly making more and more vessels. And whilst, yes, they would lose less vessels if they had the best sensors and systems in these vessels, it's far faster to simply give them a bit of a I was going to say degraded, but that's not the right word here. A lesser variant of their systems. That way they can get the vessels out faster. With all of that being said, let's actually move on to Cyratin law enforcement, as there's really, like I said, not a lot on the fleet. It's a massive fleet that exists within the core system and is comprised of Galavier vessels. I suppose I could continue to go over some of their modifications. They are significantly larger, significantly heavily armored, significantly larger weapons. Almost every single vessel in the entire fleet utilizes Solstite lances and Solstite variants, with larger vessels having higher outputs. As a matter of fact, it's one of the rare situations in which frigates are actually armed rather than simply being utilitarian like they are within the rest of the Cyratin Empire. That being said, it's also only the frigates that are capable of actually utilizing orbital bombardment, or lance strikes, due to the fact that whilst they are still Solstite, they are significantly weakened enough to the point where they can safely strike the surface of a planet and, whilst still doing incredible amounts of damage to the area that it just struck, it's not going to completely and utterly obliterate everything. After that, of course, you have some of the largest vessels. This includes their grand cruisers that even have experimental antimatter variants that are capable of outright annihilating any vessels that get within firing range. So without further ado, and all of that out of the way, let's get into Cyratin law enforcement. Now, I want you to take a specific thing into mind. Specifically, the intro video to Helldivers 2. That may seem a little weird. Why are we talking about Helldivers all of a sudden? Well, it's specifically that part where you see two Helldivers walking down the street and they wave at the guy who's out front of his house. This is Cyratin law enforcement. No, they're not Helldivers. But Cyratin law enforcement can be seen absolutely everywhere. Not only are they within patrol cars, they're also simply walking down the streets and are even utilizing aircraft, moving around to wherever they need to. The Cyratin Empire takes law enforcement and the law in general incredibly seriously. Whilst it's certainly not a ruling with an iron fist type of situation, you don't need to look very far to see a member of Cyratin law enforcement. Now, there are two different variants of law enforcement. This isn't including things like detectives and stuff. The two members of law enforcement are enforcers and peacekeepers. Enforcers are essentially like, honestly, Helldivers. These are individuals that have received special training, are very capable of dealing with incredibly dangerous situations, and in rare cases are even actively sent out onto battlefields. Peacekeepers, on the other hand, are a whole nother level. You can essentially think of them as Cyberpunk 2077 max tac. These guys do not mess around. When a peacekeeper strides onto the battlefield, whatever engagement it may be, they're oftentimes alone, supported only by the remaining enforcers if there are any, and they're capable of locking down the situation. Now, you may be assuming that this is most likely cops with body armor, full body armor. And you're not necessarily wrong, but we're not just using some primitive material. You know, this isn't some metal armor, it's definitely not plastic, and it's definitely not something like Kevlar. It's a very strange synthetic fiber that the Cyratin Empire managed to manufacture. It's almost on the level of corrodium, but not quite. And it doesn't even use corrodium. It's incredibly durable, incredibly flexible, and is capable of absorbing 100% of force and momentum throughout itself and imparting none of that force and momentum on anything beneath it. What I mean by this is that basic ballistics vests, when you're shot with one, and it's assuming that it's a ballistics vest that is rated for the caliber that you're being shot at with, it's oftentimes multiple layers of various different materials, and they're designed to slow down the bullet as much as possible before completely stopping it before it can penetrate all the way through. That being said, there's still an enormous amount of force that is put onto your body directly below the ballistics vest, and that's simply just bullets move fast and they hit hard. Even something small like a 9mm, it moves fast and it hits hard. And as a result, there's going to be force that is exerted onto your body through the ballistics vest is going to be significantly less because of said ballistics vest, but there's still force there. You know, this strange synthetic material, which I haven't given a name yet, it's capable of absorbing 100% of this energy. Now, if we're using something big, like a shotgun, or even something like, let's say, a sniper rifle or anti-material rifle, there's still going to be force that is pushed onto your body, but small and medium caliber rounds, oftentimes you won't even notice that you've been shot. At least if you're a member of Cyratin law enforcement, you're one of the enforcers. Their armor is comprised almost solely of this fabric, or fabric-adjacent material. It's capable of being worn over or under the clothing, and oftentimes enforcers will also have a corrodium, best can be described as a plate carrier type of thing. You know, it's designed to hold armor plates, but it's not something like an actual chest plate. You know, that doesn't make sense because that's where plate carrier is located, is on the chest. But you know what I mean. You know, a piece of armor that encompasses the entirety of your torso on all sides, and may even have built-in what do they call it? Pauldrons. Pauldrons, right? Yeah, I think so. Things that go over your shoulders. You know, something that is completely covering the entirety of your torso. It's armor. It's protecting you. It's not necessarily on the level of that, you know, but it provides extra defense. Cyratin law enforcement officers, or enforcers, are equipped with a multitude of different gadgets and tools. Their primary objective is to resolve the situation with the least amount of violence possible, and their equipment is specifically tailored for this. One interesting thing about Cyratins is the fact that their brains, shall we say, resonate at a very special frequency. And it just so happens that there is an opposite frequency that is capable of being put on Cyratins, and it basically almost knocks them out when they're exposed to it. As a result, Cyratin law enforcement or Cyratin enforcers have access to sonic grenades. This safely incapacitates any Cyratins in the area, whether that be due to civil unrest, active attack, or just simply knock them out so that they're in an area that we know that they're there. They're safe now because we know that they're there. We can protect them in that location. Cyratins, as you can imagine, being almost entirely bioengineered at this point, also have a multitude of immunities to various different problems that humans have. For example, something like tear gas doesn't affect Cyratins. However, the Cyratins have developed a significantly more atrocious variant of tear gas that does affect them. And if it was used on a human, it would likely kill the human. It is incredibly potent enough to actually get through their genetic augmentations. Perhaps one of the most important tools that enforcers have access to is not only an electric stun baton that, as you can imagine, does exactly as it sounds. It's essentially a big stick, kind of like a billy club or a baton, and it's basically electrified with a specific amount of electricity running through it. I'm trying to remember back to 7th grade science. There's amps, volts, and ohm. Ohm is the resistance. Amps, I believe, is what kills you, and volts is the pressure. So the higher the volt, the more effect it has on you, but the higher the amp, the more deadly it is, I believe. If I'm remembering correct, I could be remembering incorrectly. It's been a long time since I've done anything related to electricity. But basically, the non-lethal one that is an ohm, whichever of the two that is, amps or volts, it has an insane amount and is capable of delivering a shock sufficient enough to completely mess up maybe not mess up, but completely interrupt the nervous system throughout the body in a safe way so, it's not quite literally frying the nervous system and preventing them from moving again, but simply just poking them gently with this baton will 9 times out of 10 knock a Cyratin out and probably put them into a sort of state of paralysis. One of the most versatile tools that they have, however, is their primary and secondary weapons, these being pulse weapons. Specifically, a pulse rifle and a pulse pistol. Now, we've talked about pulse technology before. It originally came about when the Cyratin Empire first encountered the Barramon. The Barramon were a massive problem. Back then, the Cyratin Empire was still largely using laser and plasma-based technology, which was roughly on par to what humanity had at the time. Unfortunately, due to the natural, shall we say, constitution of Barramon, they would oftentimes just end up losing themselves in a berserking rage and charging the front lines. The weapons that they had, despite being laser and plasma, simply just weren't sufficient enough, and they required something new, something dangerous, but at the same time, something that isn't necessarily dangerous at all. And intro pulse technology. Pulse technology is an astonishing amount of energy that is held within a containment field. And this containment field is fired forward, and when it comes into contact with something, the containment field bursts and causes essentially an energy explosion at the impact site. Now, there are 2 variants of pulse munitions, the one that they used in the war and the one that Cyratin law enforcement use. Back in the war, this was a hyper-lethal energy concoction, mixed with a whole bunch of different types of energies. Basically, the Cyratin Empire was experimenting with what fucks up the Barramon the most. Well, they ended up finding a solution, although the records from back during that time aren't exactly clear what the composition of that energy was. Then you have the variant that Cyratin law enforcement uses, which is non-lethal. It's essentially, again, similar to the electric baton that they have. It delivers an electrical charge from range, and as a result, it's simply just known as stun munitions, for simplicity's sake. As a result, they can easily, let's say there's a riot going on, or general civil unrest. It's non-lethal. It has been used thousands is an understatement. It's been used billions of times across the entirety of the Cyratin Empire. Never once has there been a fatality so long as it has been set to non-lethal mode. And as a result, they can simply basically just blind fire it into the crowd. If somebody gets hit multiple times, it doesn't really do anything. It still gives them essentially paralysis. They drop to the ground, getting hit multiple times. Doesn't really do anything. It might start singeing their clothes simply because we're dealing with incredibly dangerous energies here. Well, not dangerous, but we're using a lot of energy here. Energy in its basic form is just heat, so on and so forth. So eventually it might start singeing clothes, but it's never going to do any damage to skin, let alone Cyratin skin, which is already harder than standard human skin. As a result, they can literally just sweep it back and forth through a crowd, giving everybody essentially paralysis debuffs, and suddenly the riot is contained. Not a single fatality. No need for excessive force. They didn't need to use sonic grenades, although they certainly could have. They didn't need to use the Cyratin tear gas equivalent, although they certainly could have. They didn't even need to get into melee range with the baton in order to deal with them and potentially get injured. There was no need. They could simply deal with it at range. Now, it should be noted that the pulse rifle is exclusively non-lethal. It does not have a lethal setting. The pulse pistol that they have on them, however, does have a lethal setting. It is capable of being swapped between lethal and non-lethal, depending on the situation. Now, here's where things get kind of crazy. Cyratin enforcers are augmented. Usually cybernetically, very rarely genetically, unless it's absolutely necessary. They're honestly running the borderline of Cyratin enforcers and humanity's military. They oftentimes have cybernetic implantations, such as a permanently attached exoskeleton on their body. It's essentially an exoskeleton that has been grafted not only to the bones but also to the nervous system, allowing for much finer control, far more powerful control, shall we say, but it's obviously permanent now. Not only this, but they also can have entire limbs replaced should this be a requirement, so on and so forth. They're certainly not on the level of Cyratin Marines or the Royal Vanguard, but they are capable of holding their own in a battle. In fact, whilst it would certainly be an effort for them, a Cyratin Enforcer could go toe-to-toe in a melee brawl with a Barramon and a Bastillion, either or, as both have incredible physical capabilities. That being said, it's going to be an arduous display of strength, shall we say, for the Enforcer. But if they know what they're doing, they could do it. And that's not something a lot of people can say. Cyratin Royal Army definitely can't do something like that, not unless they're in power armor. Cyratin Marines, relatively on the same level, if not stronger. Cyratin Royal Vanguard, they could probably do the same as the Cyratin Marines, simply due to the armor that they have. But beyond this, we have Cyratin Peacekeepers. And this is where things kind of get crazy, as Cyratin Peacekeepers are basically Cyratin Marauders that either failed the initial modification process or had to be honorably discharged from the military due to some sort of injury. That does not mean that a peacekeeper should be dealt with lightly. As I said, they're essentially equivalent to Cyberpunk 2077 Max Tac. These are the guys that are sent in for the really bad situations. What are they used in Cyberpunk? Cyberpsychosis. That's when Max Tac is typically sent in. And they are a take no prisoners, fuck everything up force. That's basically what the Peacekeepers are. That's not to say that the Peacekeepers can't use non-lethal. They certainly can. They can easily incapacitate the enemy. They don't have to use lethal force. Although typically, if they're sending in a Peacekeeper, chances are lethal force is required, and it's beyond what a standard enforcer is capable of handling. So as I said, Peacekeepers are essentially Cyratin marauders that, for whatever reason, are no longer in the military. They receive special genetic and cybernetic augmentations and enhancements specifically for these Cyratin peacekeepers. Not only this, but a few of the modifications that marauders do have are removed, such as the incredibly short-range skip-jump tech. It's oftentimes far too dangerous to be using in an urban setting, which is usually where peacekeepers will be. As a result, that augmentation is removed from them. That being said, they're still capable of utilizing that strange marauder energy, and it is still just as dangerous as always. Peacekeepers themselves come in full body armor made of solid corrodium, coming in at 1/8 inch. We've talked about this many times at this point, and you guys should be getting used to this. 1/8 inch is on the same level as Cyratin Marines, as well as the Cyratin Royal Vanguard with their Solstite variant. This is a lot of armor, but then again, think about it. They're equivalent to max tac. They're sent in to the worst possible situations that falls under the jurisdiction of law enforcement. They have to be able to handle the situation on their own, as there's really not a lot of them. Oftentimes, a planet will be lucky if it has one peacekeeper on it. Oftentimes, it's down to solely the enforcers to deal with the situation, especially if it's a planet that can't afford or simply isn't lucky enough to have a Cyratin peacekeeper that wants to volunteer. As a result, it's very rare to even have one on your planet because of how, again, rare they are. That being said, if you do have one and there is any situation that enforcers can't handle, the peacekeeper can easily mop the floor with them. They have the standard marauder augmentations, which means it is pure blitzkrieg style speed and agility over anything else. They are not heavily armored. That being said, they obviously do have the 1/8 corrodium plate that is specifically skeletonized as much as possible. You know, areas that are important to have that 1/8, you know, specifically on the torso, around the organs and stuff, that's still the normal armor thickness, but other locations that may not be quite as important have been skeletonized as much as possible to reduce as much weight as possible. Marauders are capable of a lot of things, but I highly, highly doubt they're capable of moving at high speeds with that much corrodium on them. Peacekeepers, as I said, are designed as the lethal variant to enforcers. As a result, they're oftentimes equipped with Solstite and even antimatter weaponry to deal with any type of situation. That being said, it's almost unheard of to see a peacekeeper out in the general population. Before a peacekeeper is sent in, oftentimes population centers will be evacuated. You know, the immediate local area of whatever is happening will be evacuated. There's not any civilians. And this isn't so much of a concern of secrecy, more so a concern of safety, due to a fact that peacekeepers, as I've said multiple times, they're sent into the worst situations, which means they are allowed to do whatever they have to in order to deal with the situation. If that involves taking down buildings during the fight by utilizing demolitions charges and stuff, they're sanctioned to use that type of stuff. You know, they're only ever sent in when the Cyratin Empire knows that there aren't going to be any civilian losses as a result of whatever the hell requires the attention of a peacekeeper. As a result, they're essentially one-man armies, you know? And we've talked about this before, but we never really went in depth. And that is rebel cells. Rebels, for whatever reason, are a problem within the Cyratin Empire. Nobody really knows why. We've talked about this before. The Cyratin Empire is essentially the ultimate utopia. You know? Like, you literally have to choose to live on the streets homeless in order to be homeless. You know, if you have a job, you can afford every single thing that you need. Even if you're the poorest person in the Cyratin Empire, you're getting 3 meals a day, you can afford clothes, you have shelter, you have clean water, you have a place to sleep. You know, you may not have the luxuries of, say, the quote-unquote upper class of the Cyratin Empire, but you're not going to be underpaid to the point where you can't keep your home, where you can't feed yourself properly, where you can't have good clothes. You know? The situation isn't going to be perfect, mind you, but you can make a humble, acceptable living off of even the poorest person. Despite this, some people within the Cyratin Empire become agitated for one reason or another. Nobody's really sure why they become agitated, but they do, and they end up becoming a rebel cell. Now, normally, it's down to the defense army of the planet to deal with these types of situations, largely due to the fact that law enforcement already has enough of its hands full with enough things. However, if it's a particularly nasty den of rebels, the Cyratin Empire, or planetary governor in this type of situation, may opt to simply send in the peacekeeper. Typically, they have the running order of capture as many rebels alive as possible, due to the fact that these are still Cyratins, usually. Some rebel cells aren't Cyratin at all, in which case there's still a priority to take them in alive, but it's not nearly as important, you know? It's more of a situation like, if it's Cyratin rebels, it's like, do everything you can to bring them in alive and not kill them. Kill them if you absolutely must, but I'd rather you bring them back alive. Whereas if they're not Cyratins, it's like, if a few of them die, we're not going to be too upset about it, but try and bring them back alive, you know? Like, do what you can, but don't, like, put yourself into danger, type of thing. And this is due to the fact that old habits die hard, ancient Cyratin empires were xenophobic, some things transfer across time and still persist within current Cyratin empires. Now, here's the most interesting thing. Cyratin law enforcement has access to military-grade weapons, armor, and vehicles. And this is due to the fact that in any type of situation in which a planet is being besieged and there is an invading force coming down to the planet's surface, it's oftentimes Cyratin law enforcement that is the first responders. And as a result, they are given the unique privilege of being able to field vehicles of war, being capable of fielding armor that is relatively on par with corrodium flak armor. They're capable of fielding weapons that aren't the pulse weapons, the pulse rifles. Not only this, but certain enforcers, especially if they're high-ranking enforcers, are even outfitted with pulse rifles that are even capable of going to a lethal setting rather than just being purely non-lethal. However, these are incredibly rare. Oftentimes, enforcers will have armories located in multiple points throughout the entire city. They can quickly go to one of these armory locations, and these armories are, again, they're essentially military bases that are hidden underneath the city with an access point onto the main streets, where then they can deploy light, medium, and heavily armored personnel carriers, light, medium tanks, and APCs. You know, they can deploy a lot of various different war vehicles to any type of situation. Now, is it going to be nearly on the same level as, say, the Royal Army? No. They're not going to have heavy tanks. They're not going to have anything with big guns on it with excessive amounts of armor, largely due to the fact that this is the police. This isn't the military. Whilst, yes, they do have military training, they're still police. And as a result, the Cyratin Empire isn't willing to give them anything astonishing. That being said, the Cyratin Empire has given them training and approval for use of fighter craft in atmospheric conditions. So they have flying units as well. And not only this, but within these armories, they also have oftentimes plasmite rifles, sometimes rarely solstite variants. That way, they can run in, they can quickly throw on the armor, quickly grab their weapon, and immediately respond to any invading force. And oftentimes, like I said, they're the first responders. Oftentimes, it takes a fair amount of time before the royal army of that planet kind of notices and fully mobilizes. By the time they're fully mobilized, Cyratin law enforcement is already dug in deep, utilizing various different strategic locations to hold as long as they can until the main army arrives. And it's one of the reasons why there's some of the most badass people around. You know, they're just common civilians. They don't have any genetic modifications. They don't really have anything going for them. They have their equipment, which is non-lethal, as a rule of thumb, generally non-lethal. And they have some cybernetic augmentations that, let's be honest, probably aren't designed to prolong their existence. You know, it's probably not cybernetic augmentations that add armor to them. You know? They have what they have. It's essentially like the Sororitas. You know, technically the Sister of Battles have their weird little miracle bullshit going on there, whatever the hell that is. But the Sisters of Battle are essentially just women. Like, from my understanding of the Sororitas, which they're pretty cool, but I haven't done a whole lot of research into them, they're just women. They're not like the Astartes. They don't have massive, hyper-aggressive genetic modifications. They're not like the Mechanicus that are chipping away their flesh and bone and replacing it with metal and machinery. They're just women that give no fucks about who you are or what you're doing. Because if you are daring to do anything against the God Emperor, they will fuck your shit up. And that's essentially what the Enforcers are. You know, they're non-religious Sisters of Battle, basically. Only men and women. And that's basically all they've got going for them. They have their equipment. They have the meager amount of cybernetic augmentations. And they uphold the law. And oftentimes, they are the first to respond in any invasion. And it's their job to hold it off as well as possible for as long as possible. And it just honestly makes them pretty damn badass because, like, cybernetic augmentations, I feel like some people are going to kind of think of this the wrong way. This isn't like Black Ops campaign level of cybernetic. Which one was that? 4, I think, where they had like this, like the really fancy cybernetic augmentations. Maybe it was 3. I don't remember. Point being is that type of thing doesn't exist. Well, it does, but that's not what Enforcers have. You know, it's oftentimes the permanently implanted exoskeleton, and let's say you got a bad leg. They'll replace your leg with a bionic, but it's not necessarily going to be like stellar. I mean, if your leg gets shot by, let's say, a 5.56, it's not really going to do anything, you know? It's more durable than flesh and bone, we'll say that, but it's not, they're usually not armor-plated. Any armor plating that they have is mainly superficial at best, just to protect the wirings and hydraulics and whatever the hell else is in their bionics. You know, it's not anything super intricate, you know. It's basically, it gives you your limb back with an ever so slight increase to efficiency. You know, they're slightly better, but at that point you might as well just stick with your original limbs unless you have to swap them out. You know, they're not like humanity's cybernetics. And that's kind of the point, is because the Cyratin Empire wants to focus on genetics rather than cybernetics. that, and let's be honest, humanity needs something unique for them. As a result, they respond to almost any situation that can happen on the battle or on the planet. They're the first responders. They have relatively alright gear. If there's a rebel cell, the military usually handles it. If the military can't handle it, then peacekeepers are sent in. Peacekeepers are so much more powerful than a standard enforcer. Surprisingly enough, though, that's kind of it. I figured that there was going to be a lot more explaining to do, but I feel like I've summed it up pretty damn well, which is unfortunate because we're only on the 45-minute mark. Let me take just a quick second to scan my memories and see if maybe there's something that I'm missing, because I don't think there is. So yeah, we are going to do the next episode will probably either be on Molly Jackson or Benny Maru. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys are looking forward to Saturday and Sunday's live streams at noon Central Standard Time. And I hope that you guys are also looking forward to next Tuesday's episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. So, until then, guys, see ya.